December 23, 1944. The forests of the Belgian Ardennes lay silent under a heavy blanket of snow, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire that had become the soundtrack of winter. Somewhere in those frozen woods, between German lines that tightened like a noose around the town of Bastogne, a decision was about to be made that would change the course of one of World War II's most desperate sieges. Inside Bastogne's crumbling perimeter, American paratroopers huddled in foxholes that had become ice coffin. Their ammunition was running low. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, but it was fuel, that precious liquid gold of modern warfare, that kept General Anthony McAuliffe awake at night. Without it, the tanks and half-tracks defending the vital crossroads would become nothing more than expensive metal coffins. Without it, the generators powering the field hospitals would fall silent. Without it, Bastogne would fall, and with it, perhaps the entire Allied line in the Ardennes. This is the story of how one Belgian civilian armed with nothing but local knowledge and what American officers would later call dangerous guesswork led a convoy of fuel trucks through supposedly impassable terrain to reach the encircled defenders. It's a story that has been overshadowed by the more famous moments of the Battle of the Bulge, the dramatic siege of Bastogne, General Patton's relief column, and McAuliffe's defiant one-word reply to German surrender demands. But without this quiet act of courage on those frozen back roads, none of those other stories might have ended the way they did. To understand how desperate the situation had become, we need to go back to December 16th, when the German offensive first erupted out of the morning mist. The Germans called it Operation Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's last great gamble on the Western Front. More than 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, had smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. Their objective was audacious: to drive all the way to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies in two and forcing a negotiated peace that might save the Third Reich from total destruction. But Hitler's plan had one critical weakness built into its very foundation: fuel. The German war machine was running on fumes. Allied bombing had crippled synthetic fuel production across the Reich. The panzers and mechanized divisions assembled for this desperate thrust had barely enough gasoline to reach their starting positions. German planners knew this. Their solution was brutally simple. They would capture Allied fuel dumps along the way. The Americans, they calculated, had stockpiled millions of gallons at depots throughout Belgium. Take those depots, and the offensive could continue. Fail to capture them, and the attack would grind to a halt, regardless of tactical success. Bastogne sat at the heart of this fuel crisis. The small Belgian town was unremarkable in most ways, a collection of stone buildings and narrow streets that had seen armies come and go for centuries. But geography had given Bastogne something priceless. 7 major roads converged there, the only good routes through the dense Ardennes forest. Control those roads, and you controlled movement across the entire region. Those roads also led to several large American fuel depots in the area. When German forces began their surprise attack on that foggy December morning, they moved with terrifying speed. American units, many of them green replacements or exhausted veterans, resting in what they thought was a quiet sector, found themselves overwhelmed. Communications broke down. Units scattered. The careful plans and supply lines that keep a modern army functioning began to unravel. But even in that chaos, a few quick-thinking officers and enlisted men understood what was at stake. If the Germans captured the fuel depots intact, the offensive might actually succeed. Throughout that first day and the days that followed, a desperate race unfolded across eastern Belgium. American truck drivers, many of them African-American soldiers serving in the segregated transportation corps units of the Red Ball Express, drove through the night to evacuate fuel stocks ahead of the advancing panzers. At depot after depot, the scene repeated itself. Trucks rolling in, being filled with jerry cans of gasoline, then racing west toward safety. In some places, there wasn't even time for that. Engineers set demolition charges, soldiers shot tracer rounds into fuel dumps, creating walls of flame that stretched for miles. Better to destroy it than let the enemy have it. One of the largest depots sat near the village of Stavelot. When SS Panzer Commander Joachim Peiper's Spearhead reached the area, they found 3 million gallons of American fuel just sitting there, enough to keep their entire division running for weeks, but they were hours too late. A small group of Belgian soldiers working with American engineers had already turned the depot into an inferno. Peiper's tanks, already running on fumes, had to watch helplessly as the fuel they desperately needed went up in smoke. Similar scenes played out across the Ardennes. The Germans captured some depots, enough to keep moving, but nowhere near what they needed. And with each passing hour, their fuel situation grew more critical. Meanwhile, Bastogne was being cut off. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, had been rushed to the town by truck convoy, arriving just ahead of the encircling German forces. They were joined by elements of the 10th Armored Division and other units that had managed to fall back to the crossroads. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. 7 roads led into town, and German forces now controlled every one of them. Inside the shrinking perimeter, the situation quickly became desperate. The 101st had been pulled from reserve with just hours' notice. Many paratroopers were still wearing their summer uniforms. They had minimal cold weather gear, limited ammunition, and almost no heavy weapons. What they did have was determination and the knowledge that if Bastogne fell, the entire American line in the Ardennes might collapse. But determination doesn't run engines or power radios. For that, you need fuel, and fuel was running dangerously low. General McAuliffe, the acting division commander, knew exactly how bad things were. His staff officers gave him the numbers each morning, and each morning those numbers grew worse. The tanks and half-tracks forming the mobile reserve burned through fuel at an alarming rate, even when they weren't in combat. The generators keeping the aid stations running, the vehicles shuttling wounded to the makeshift hospitals, the jeeps maintaining communication between scattered defensive positions, all of them needed gasoline. And the supplies inside the perimeter wouldn't last more than a few days. The Air Force tried to help. When the weather briefly cleared on December 23rd, transport planes dropped supplies by parachute, but dropping fuel by air was desperately inefficient. Containers broke on impact. Parachutes drifted into German-held areas, and the quantities that could be delivered this way were tiny compared to what a single truck convoy could carry. McAuliffe needed trucks full of fuel to reach Bastogne by ground. But how? Every road was cut. German forces had established roadblocks and checkpoints on all the main routes. Their artillery covered the approaches. Any convoy trying to fight its way through would be destroyed before it got halfway to town. And that's where our story really begins. 30 miles to the southwest, at a forward supply depot near the town of Neufchâteau, American logistics officers were facing their own crisis. They had fuel. Thousands of gallons sat in jerry cans stacked in a frozen field. They had trucks, deuce and a halfs lined up and ready to roll. What they didn't have was a route. Every officer who looked at the maps came to the same conclusion. There was no way through. The Germans controlled all the primary roads. The secondary roads, the ones that wound through the forests and over the hills, were marked as impassable in winter conditions. Deep snow, ice, narrow tracks barely wide enough for a car, let alone a 2.5-ton truck. The maps were clear. It couldn't be done. But one man thought otherwise. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps was never properly recorded. In the few official reports that mention this mission, he's referred to simply as the Belgian Guide. Some accounts give him the name Marcel. Others call him Jean-Claude. The truth is, we'll probably never know his real name with certainty. What we do know is that he was a local man, probably in his 50s, who had lived his entire life in the Ardennes region. He knew these forests the way a sailor knows the sea, every hill and valley, every back road and logging trail. When word reached the Belgian resistance cells in the area that the Americans needed to get supplies into Bastogne, this man volunteered. He approached the American officers with an audacious claim. He could lead trucks to Bastogne by a route the Germans didn't know existed, a network of forestry roads, farm tracks, and what he called shepherd's paths that wound through the densest parts of the Ardennes, routes that didn't appear on any military map because they weren't considered real roads at all. The American officers were skeptical, naturally. Their entire training emphasized following established supply routes, maintaining communications, coordinating with artillery support. What this Belgian was proposing sounded less like a military operation and more like madness, taking a convoy of fuel trucks, essentially rolling bombs through unmapped territory in the dead of winter, through forests that might be full of German patrols, based on nothing but one man's word that he knew the way. One young captain asked the question everyone was thinking. How could he be sure these trails were even passable? Some of them hadn't been used in years. The Belgian's answer would become part of the legend. He shrugged in that particularly Gallic way and said something that translates roughly as, "I know my forest. We'll know if it works when we try." Guesswork. That's what it sounded like to the Americans. Dangerous, potentially fatal guesswork. But as the hours ticked by and the situation in Bastogne grew more desperate, that guesswork started to look like the only option. The decision was made on the afternoon of December 23rd. A fuel convoy would be assembled. Not a large one. The risks were too great for that. Just 6 trucks, each loaded with 200 jerry cans of gasoline, enough to make a real difference in Bastogne if they got through, but not so much that the loss would cripple the supply depot if they didn't. The trucks were carefully prepared. Chains were fitted to all the wheels for better traction in snow and ice. The loads were secured with extra straps. Engine oil was changed for winter-grade lubricant. Drivers were selected from among the most experienced men available. Soldiers who had driven through every kind of weather and terrain the European theater could throw at them. And then there was the question of armament. A fuel convoy in enemy territory needed protection, but heavy weapons meant extra weight. And weight meant the trucks might not make it through the narrow trails the Belgian guide was planning to use. They compromised. Each truck would carry a driver and 1 soldier armed with a Thompson submachine gun. A single jeep with a .30 caliber machine gun would lead the convoy. Another jeep would bring up the rear. If they ran into serious German resistance, they were supposed to scatter and try to make it back to American lines. Nobody talked about what would happen to those thousands of gallons of gasoline if the convoy was fired upon. The Belgian guide studied the sky that afternoon. The weather was changing. The crystal-clear conditions that had allowed the Air Force to drop supplies over Bastogne were giving way to the more typical Ardennes winter weather, low clouds, and the threat of more snow. He seemed satisfied with this. Bad weather would keep German aircraft grounded. It would also reduce visibility, making it less likely that enemy patrols would spot the convoy. As darkness fell, the trucks rumbled to life. 6 engines coughing in the cold, their exhausts creating clouds of vapor in the freezing air. The Belgian guide climbed into the lead jeep alongside the driver and the vehicle commander, a young lieutenant who looked like he was trying very hard not to show how nervous he was. The convoy rolled out at 6 p.m., moving slowly through Neuchâtel's darkened streets. No headlights, not yet. They would navigate by moonlight and the faint phosphorescent glow of the snow until they were well clear of anything that might attract German attention. The townspeople who saw them go, huddled in doorways despite the curfew, knew better than to wave or cheer. This was occupied territory after all, even if the occupiers at the moment were friendly. Sound carried far on cold nights, and who knew where German listening posts might be? 2 miles out of town, the Belgian guide directed them onto a side road, then onto an even smaller track. The lieutenant checked his map by the dim light of a hooded flashlight and realized with growing alarm that they were already off any marked route. When he mentioned this, the guide simply tapped his temple and said something about the map being up here, where it mattered. What followed was a journey that would have been remarkable in daylight and good weather. In the darkness of a winter night, with the constant threat of German forces nearby, it was something close to miraculous. The Belgian guide seemed to navigate by instinct or perhaps by some sixth sense that came from a lifetime in these forests. He would peer into the darkness, studying shadows and snow-covered shapes, then point decisively that way. The roads, if you could call them that, twisted and turned through the trees. Sometimes they climbed hills, so steep that the heavily loaded trucks had to take them in first gear, engines screaming, drivers fighting to keep the wheels from spinning on the ice. Other times they descended into valleys where the tracks disappeared entirely under deep snowdrifts, and the only way forward was to follow the tree line and hope. More than once they came to places where the lieutenant was certain they would have to turn back, a fallen tree blocking the path, a stream that looked too deep and fast to ford, a slope covered in ice that seemed suicidal to attempt. But each time, the Belgian guide would get out, walk ahead to inspect the obstacle, then come back and explain, with hand gestures and his limited English, how they could get through. And each time, impossibly, they did. The fallen tree had enough space beneath it for the trucks to squeeze through if they deflated their tires slightly. The stream had a ford, invisible under the ice, that the guide remembered from before the war. The icy slope could be traversed if they went at an angle, using the trees as anchors for tow ropes. The drivers began to develop a kind of faith in their guide. This wasn't blind trust. Soldiers learned quickly not to trust blindly, but rather a growing confidence based on results. He said they could make it through that gap, and they had. He said there was a trail around that hillside, and there was. His guesswork, as the Americans had called it, was turning out to be remarkably accurate, but guesswork or knowledge, the journey was taking a severe toll. The trucks were never designed for this kind of cross-country work. Axles groaned. Transmissions heated up despite the freezing temperatures. Springs that had already endured thousands of miles of rough roads were being pushed beyond their design limits. The drivers nursed their vehicles forward with the kind of care usually reserved for wounded comrades, listening to every sound, feeling every vibration, knowing that a breakdown here could be fatal. Around 10 p.m. they had their first real scare. The Belgian guide suddenly raised his fist, the signal to stop. The convoy ground to a halt, engines idling so quietly the men could hear the wind in the trees. The guide and the lieutenant crept forward, leaving the jeep behind. They were gone for perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours to the soldiers waiting in the trucks, fingers on triggers, straining their ears for any sound that might mean discovery. When they returned, the guide was smiling, which seemed wrong somehow, given the circumstances. He explained in his broken English, mixed with French and German words. German patrol. Just there, he pointed, perhaps half a kilometer away. They had set up a roadblock on one of the main routes, which meant, and here his smile widened, that the track they were following was clear. The Germans wouldn't bother guarding roads they didn't think existed. They continued on, giving the German position a wide berth, following a route that took them even deeper into the forest. The Belgian guide's confidence seemed to grow with each kilometer. He began pointing out landmarks, though in the darkness and snow, the American soldiers couldn't understand what he was showing them. That rock, he would say, I climbed it as a boy. That turn in the path, my father brought our cart through here during the First War. The forest wasn't just terrain to him, it was home, filled with a lifetime of memories that made it as familiar as his own house. Midnight came and went. The convoy should have reached Bastogne by now if they had taken the direct route, but the direct route was held by the enemy, and this roundabout path through the wilderness was taking far longer than planned. Fuel gauges on the trucks dropped toward empty. They had enough to reach Bastogne, barely, but the margin for error was gone. If they got lost now, if they had to backtrack or try another route, they would run out of gas somewhere in the German-occupied forest. The Belgian guide seemed unconcerned by such possibilities, or perhaps he was just better at hiding his worries than the Americans. He kept them moving, always moving, through terrain that grew rougher and more challenging. At one point, they found themselves on a trail that ran along the edge of a steep ravine with barely 3 feet of clearance between the truck wheels and a drop that disappeared into darkness. The drivers had to trust that the track would hold, that centuries of erosion hadn't undermined the edge, that their guide knew what he was doing when he led them this way. Trust. That's what it came down to in the end. The Americans had to trust this Belgian civilian, this man whose name they didn't even know for certain, with their lives, and with a cargo that could change the outcome of the entire battle. It went against every instinct of military procedure. Armies function on clear chains of command, written orders, verifiable intelligence. What they were doing now was none of that. It was pure faith in one man's knowledge of his homeland. Around 2 in the morning, the Belgian guide brought them to a complete stop. He conferred with the lieutenant in their mixture of languages and gestures, pointing ahead into the darkness. They were close now, he indicated, very close to Bastogne. But this was the most dangerous part. They had to cross an area that might have German forces on either side. The route he had chosen would take them between two known German positions, through a gap that was perhaps only a few hundred meters wide. There would be no room for error, no second chances. If they were spotted, they would be fired upon from both sides. The lieutenant asked the obvious question. Was there another way? A safer route? The Belgian guide shook his head. This was the only path that trucks could take. Any other approach would bring them within sight of German observation posts. This narrow corridor threading between enemy forces was their one chance. They prepared as best they could. The machine guns on the jeeps were made ready, though everyone understood that if it came to a firefight, the fuel trucks would be the first target. The drivers checked their mirrors, making sure they could see the vehicle behind them in the dim moonlight. If the lead truck got through, but the ones behind didn't, the cargo would be divided between enemy territory and safety, all or nothing. That's what this moment had become. The Belgian guide climbed back into the lead jeep. He said something to the driver, who later reported that it translated roughly to trust the darkness. Then he pointed forward and they began to move. The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. The convoy crept forward at walking pace, trying to minimize engine noise. To their right, perhaps 300 meters away, they could see the faint glow of campfires where German forces had established a position. To their left, slightly more distant, more fires marked another enemy encampment. They were driving between the jaws of a trap, relying on darkness and the enemy's assumption that no one would be foolish enough to attempt passage here. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of tires on snow, the low rumble of engines, the breathing of the soldiers, harsh in the cold air. At one point they heard voices, German voices, singing something that might have been Christmas carol. The enemy was close enough that they could make out individual words, but the darkness held, and the singing Germans never looked toward the tree line where 6 American trucks were ghosting past. And then they were through. The fires fell behind them. The Belgian guide allowed himself a small, satisfied grunt and pointed ahead more confidently now. They had crossed the most dangerous section. What remained was merely difficult, not impossible. The last miles to Bastogne were almost anticlimactic after the tension of that gauntlet. The guide brought them onto slightly better roads, still not the main routes, but wider forestry tracks that let the trucks pick up speed. Just before dawn, they crested a hill, and there, spread out in the valley below, was Bastogne, or what was left of it. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, the damage was evident. Buildings reduced to rubble by artillery fire, streets cratered by bombs, smoke rising from a dozen fires. This was a town under siege, holding on by its fingernails against overwhelming force, but it was still holding. And as the convoy descended toward the American lines, headlights finally switched on. Now that concealment was less important than identification, the defenders saw them coming. Word spread quickly through the frozen foxholes and battered aid stations. Trucks, American trucks. They had gotten through somehow. Help had arrived. The convoy rolled through the checkpoint into Bastogne's perimeter at 6 a.m. on December 24th. Christmas Eve, the drivers, exhausted from 8 hours of the most stressful driving of their lives, were greeted by paratroopers who looked like they'd been through hell. Some of the defenders actually had tears in their eyes, not because 6 trucks was enough to break the siege. It wasn't, but because those trucks represented hope. If a convoy could get through once, maybe more would follow. Maybe they weren't completely cut off after all. General McAuliffe came personally to inspect the delivery. He stood in the pre-dawn cold, watching his men unload jerry cans of fuel, and asked to meet the drivers and their guide. The Belgian was brought forward snow-caked on his worn civilian coat, looking nothing like the military heroes that usually received generals' attention. McAuliffe asked through an interpreter how he had found a route that didn't appear on any map. The Belgian's answer, translated and recorded in various forms over the years, was simple. "I didn't find it, mon general. I've always known it was there. These are my forests." Before the Belgian guide headed back out, attempting the return journey while he still had darkness as cover, McAuliffe made sure his name was recorded. Not for any formal citation or medal. Foreign civilians couldn't receive American military decorations, but McAuliffe wanted to make sure that if this man didn't make it back, someone would remember what he had done. The return journey was, if anything, more harrowing than the inbound trip. The trucks, now empty, were lighter and could move faster, but dawn was breaking, eliminating the cover of darkness that had protected them. The Belgian guide chose a different route back, one that took them even deeper into the wilderness, but that he judged safer in daylight. They encountered German forces twice, once crossing a road just minutes after an enemy convoy had passed, another time hiding the trucks under tree cover while German infantry marched by on a nearby trail. Each time, the guide's knowledge of the terrain and his ability to anticipate safe paths proved invaluable. They reached American lines shortly after noon on December 24th, having completed a round trip that military planners would later say was impossible. The trucks had traveled perhaps 70 miles to cover a straight-line distance of 30, threading through terrain that wasn't rated for vehicle traffic, all based on one man's intimate knowledge of his homeland. The fuel they delivered kept Bastogne's mobile reserve operational for 2 critical days. It powered the generators in the aid stations where surgeons worked around the clock to save wounded men. It fueled the jeeps that maintained communications between scattered defensive positions. When German forces launched their Christmas Day attacks, attempting to break through before Patton's relief column could arrive from the south, the American tanks had enough fuel to maneuver, to respond, to hold the line. 2 days after that convoy reached Bastogne, on December 26th, Patton's 4th Armored Division finally broke through the German encirclement from the south. The siege was lifted. Bastogne had held. The German offensive had failed, not just at Bastogne, but across the entire Ardennes front. Without fuel, the panzers ground to a halt. Without momentum, the attack lost its shock value. By mid-January, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The Third Reich had gambled everything on one last throw of the dice and lost. In the grand narrative of the Battle of the Bulge, the Belgian guide's midnight convoy rarely gets mentioned. The history books focus on the dramatic moments, McAuliffe's defiant "nuts" reply, the heroic stand of the 101st Airborne, Patton's relief column racing north, the eventual Allied counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back. These are the moments that capture the imagination, the clear turning points that fit neatly into the story of how the battle was won. But wars are won by logistics as much as by heroism. They're won by fuel reaching the front when it's needed, by supplies arriving despite impossible conditions, by civilians who risk everything to help soldiers they've never met defend a freedom that benefits everyone. The Belgian guide understood this, even if he never would have expressed it in those terms. He saw soldiers who needed help, and he had knowledge that could provide that help. So he acted. No speeches, no hesitation, just quiet courage in the service of a cause he believed in. What happened to the Belgian guide after the war? The records are frustratingly incomplete. Some accounts suggest he survived and returned to his village, living out his days in the forests he knew so well. Others hint at a darker ending, that he was caught by German forces on a later mission and paid the price that resistance fighters across Europe knew they risked. Without a confirmed full name and in the chaos of the battle's final weeks, his fate was never officially documented. Perhaps that's fitting in a way. His contribution to the battle wasn't about personal glory. It was about doing what needed to be done when it needed doing, regardless of recognition or reward. The fuel reached Bastogne. The defenders held out. The siege was broken. Those were the only outcomes that mattered. But for the men who were there, the soldiers who drove those trucks through the frozen darkness, and especially for the defenders of Bastogne who saw those precious jerry cans being unloaded on Christmas Eve morning, the Belgian guide's name may be lost to history, but his deed never will be. He proved that sometimes the most valuable military intelligence isn't found in reconnaissance photos or radio intercepts. Sometimes it's carried in the memory of an old man who knows every trail in his forest and is willing to bet his life that he can find a way through. In the decades since the Battle of the Bulge, military historians have studied every aspect of the campaign. They've analyzed German strategic planning and Allied defensive responses. They've debated whether Bastogne or the Elsenborn Ridge was the more critical defensive stand. They've calculated tonnages of supplies, casualty rates, fuel consumption per kilometer for every vehicle type involved. It's all valuable scholarship, helping us understand how this massive battle unfolded. But some things can't be quantified in after-action reports or statistical analyses. The value of local knowledge, the courage of civilians caught in the crossfire who chose to resist rather than simply endure, the trust between soldiers and their guide when both knew that one wrong turn could end in death or capture. These human elements are harder to measure, but they're just as important to understanding how wars are actually fought and won. The route the Belgian guide used that night has never been precisely mapped. Modern historians and battlefield tour guides have attempted to reconstruct the journey based on the limited records available and interviews with survivors. But the terrain has changed in the 8 decades since 1944. Forestry roads have been improved or abandoned. Streams have changed course. The landmarks the guide used, a particular rock formation or a distinctive tree, are long gone. The exact path remains a mystery, which somehow seems appropriate. It was always more about the knowledge in one man's head than about any line on a map. What we do know is that the fuel delivered by that convoy made a real difference. The logs from Bastogne's supply officers show the delivery, though with minimal details about how it was accomplished. The fuel was distributed to units across the perimeter within hours of arrival. Vehicles that had been immobilized for lack of gasoline were back in action. Generators that had been shut down to conserve fuel were restarted. The medical staff who had been operating by candlelight when generators ran dry could go back to having proper illumination for their desperate work. More importantly, perhaps, the psychological impact was immeasurable. The defenders of Bastogne had been completely surrounded for days. They knew relief columns were trying to reach them, but they also knew the Germans were throwing everything they had at stopping those relief efforts. The arrival of supplies by an unexpected route through terrain the enemy thought impassable proved that the siege wasn't complete, that American ingenuity and Belgian courage could find ways through that the enemy didn't anticipate. It's worth considering what would have happened if the convoy hadn't gotten through. Would Bastogne have fallen? Probably not. The defenders were too determined, and Patton's relief was only 2 days away. But those 2 days would have been harder. More vehicles would have been abandoned for lack of fuel. More wounded would have gone without proper medical care. The defensive perimeter might have had to contract, giving up hard-won positions. When Patton finally broke through, he might have found Bastogne still standing but significantly weaker, less able to serve as a base for the counteroffensive that followed. These kinds of historical what-ifs are always speculative, but they help illustrate why every contribution matters in war, even the ones that seem small compared to the grand sweep of battles and campaigns. 6 trucks of fuel didn't win the Battle of the Bulge, but they helped keep Bastogne strong at a moment when strength was desperately needed. They kept hope alive when hope was in short supply, and they demonstrated that the local population, the Belgian civilians who had already suffered 4 years of occupation, were not passive victims but active participants in their own liberation. As we look back across the decades at that cold December night in 1944, it's easy to focus on the military aspects of the story, the tactics employed, the risks calculated and accepted, the operational success of getting supplies through enemy lines. These are important, certainly, but there's a deeper story here about human connection across barriers of language and nationality and military rank. The American soldiers driving those trucks had no reason to trust the Belgian guide except his word and his willingness to lead them into danger. They were strangers in a foreign land, following a civilian through territory where a wrong turn meant death. The Belgian guide had no reason to risk his life for foreign soldiers except his belief in the cause they were fighting for and his desire to help drive the invaders from his homeland. There were no contracts signed, no guarantees exchanged, just human beings deciding to trust each other because the situation demanded it and because, at some fundamental level, they recognized they were on the same side of a struggle that transcended national boundaries. This kind of informal alliance between military forces and local civilians happened throughout the war in Europe. French resistance fighters guiding Allied units through the Bocage country after D-Day. Italian partisans helping Allied soldiers escape from POW camps. Dutch civilians hiding Allied airmen shot down over their country. Greek villagers sharing what little food they had with British commandos operating behind German lines. The Belgian Guide's midnight convoy was one instance of a pattern that repeated across the continent. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the moment called for it. The legacy of that convoy extends beyond its immediate tactical impact. After the war, when the citizens of Bastogne rebuilt their shattered town, they made sure to honor not just the American soldiers who had defended them, but also the Belgian civilians who had contributed to that defense. Memorials were erected, names were recorded when possible, stories were preserved in local museums and family histories. The town understood that its liberation had been a collective effort, military and civilian, American and Belgian, working together toward a common goal. Today, visitors to Bastogne can walk the streets that were defended in December 1944. They can visit the museums that tell the story of the siege. They can stand in the foxholes where paratroopers froze while holding the line against German attack. They can see the Martisson Memorial, dedicated to the American soldiers who fell in the Battle of the Bulge. The town has become a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand what happened during those desperate winter weeks. But the back roads through the Ardennes forest, the routes that the Belgian Guide used to thread his convoy between German positions, those remain largely uncommented and unmarked. There are no signs explaining what happened on those dark trails, no monuments to mark where the convoy passed. The forest keeps its secrets, just as it did that night in 1944. Perhaps that's as it should be. The Belgian Guide didn't act for recognition or memorial plaques. He acted because he saw a need and had the ability to help meet that need. His reward was the knowledge that the fuel reached its destination, that the defenders could keep fighting, that his contribution mattered. Sometimes that has to be enough. The story of the convoy reminds us that in war, as in life, success often depends on cooperation between people with very different backgrounds and skill. The American military had trucks and fuel and trained soldiers, but they didn't have knowledge of the local terrain, that priceless understanding of which paths were passable and which routes the enemy wouldn't expect. The Belgian Guide had that knowledge, but not the resources to use it effectively without military support. Together, combining their different strengths, they accomplished what neither could have done alone. It's a lesson worth remembering in any era. The problems we face, whether in war or peace, are rarely solved by any single group or individual. They're solved by cooperation, by pooling different kinds of knowledge and expertise, by trusting people who bring capabilities we don't possess ourselves. The American officers who accepted the Belgian Guide's plan were admitting the limits of their own knowledge and their willingness to trust local expertise. The Belgian Guide who volunteered was placing his faith in the Americans' ability to protect his homeland if given the tools to do so. Neither could succeed without the other. As the sun set on December 24, 1944, the defenders of Bastogne faced another night of German attacks, but this time they faced it with full fuel tanks, with generators running, with the knowledge that the siege wasn't as complete as the enemy believed. Somewhere out in the darkness, the Belgian Guide was making his way back to American lines, his trucks empty, but his mission accomplished. He had taken what the American officers called guesswork and proven it to be hard-won knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in those forests. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another 3 weeks after that midnight convoy. Thousands more would fall before the German offensive finally collapsed. Bastogne would endure more attacks, more hardship, before Patton's relief column finally broke through. But on that Christmas Eve, thanks to 6 trucks of fuel delivered by the most unlikely supply route in the European theater, the defenders had what they needed to keep fighting. And in war, sometimes that's the only victory that matters. Not the decisive breakthrough or the heroic last stand, but simply having enough supplies to keep going, to hold on one more day, to be still standing when the enemy finally realizes he can't win. In the end, the Belgian Guide's greatest guesswork wasn't about which path to take through the forest. It was his guess that ordinary courage, applied at the right moment in the right place, could change the course of history. On that score, his guess proved absolutely correct. The fuel reached Bastogne. The defenders held. The siege was broken, and somewhere in the story of how that happened, carried in the memories of aging veterans and preserved in fragmentary records and local legends, the Belgian Guide's midnight convoy holds its place, not as the most dramatic moment of the Battle of the Bulge, perhaps, but as one of the most essential, a reminder that wars are won not just by grand strategies and heroic charges, but by fuel deliveries made through impossible terrain by people who refused to accept that impossible meant the same thing as undoable. As we remember the Battle of the Bulge and the Siege of Bastogne, we honor the soldiers who fought there, the paratroopers who held frozen foxholes against overwhelming odds, the tank crews who maneuvered in desperate defensive battles, the medics who saved lives under impossible conditions. We remember General McAuliffe's defiant response to German surrender demands. We remember General Patton's relief column driving north through snowstorms to break the siege. But we should also remember the Belgian Guide, whose name may be lost, but whose deed endures. In the darkest hours of that desperate December, he proved that knowledge is power, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the longest way round is the shortest way home. 6 trucks full of fuel delivered by Guesswork through impossible terrain on a frozen winter night. In the grand sweep of World War II, it might seem like a small thing. But for the defenders of Bastogne, watching those trucks roll through their perimeter on Christmas Eve morning, it was everything they needed, and that made all the difference.